Welcome to the Fear and Greed Business Interview. I'm Sean Aylmer. Australia is shifting towards renewable energy with a commitment to reach net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. But that transition comes with plenty of challenges, and one of the biggest is ensuring there's enough power, not just to keep the lights on, but to keep business and heavy industry running. There are short-term fixes like the extensions to coal-fired power plants as they're gradually phased out. Then there are long-term plans like the federal government's future gas strategy, which outlines how natural gas will be used for energy security during the transition. Samantha McCulloch is the Chief Executive of Australian Energy Producers, which is a supporter of this podcast. Australian Energy Producers is the peak body representing Australia's oil and gas exploration and production industry. Sam, welcome to Fear and Greed.
Hi, Sean. Thanks so much for having me.
To put it simply, what's the main priority here? Is it energy security, ensuring we have enough power during the transition? Is that what this is about?
Look, it has to be about all of the above, really. And this is where natural gas plays a really important role in terms of supporting the transition to net zero, but also ensuring that reliability and affordability of the transition along the way. We've spoken already about the power generation sector, and here we see natural gas being that sort of reliable backup as we deploy more renewables into the system and supporting the shift away from coal. And, natural gas is also supplying around 42% of the energy needed by our manufacturing sector. So it's playing a really key role in terms of our economy, in terms of energy security, but also in terms of emissions reductions as we sort of transition towards net zero by 2050.
Okay, I think it's important to highlight this point. Gas and coal are different when it comes to carbon emissions. How different are they?
Well, when you're talking about power generation, the emissions on average from gas-fired power generation are about half that of coal. So you can actually get very significant emissions reductions, and we've seen this internationally, including in countries like the United States, where that coal to gas switching has had a really significant impact on overall emissions reductions. Gas is also supporting, backing up renewables. So it provides that reliable source of power that enables us to deploy more renewables into the system, but still have that reliability so that, when the sun's not shining or the wind's not blowing, we do still have that reliable power going to households, going to Australian businesses.
The government's clearly identified gas as being key to the transition with its future gas strategy. It's a very difficult area to make policy in because it's impossible to satisfy everyone. But can you run me through the key parts of that strategy?
Well, what we need here is an evidence-based and pragmatic discussion about the energy mix and the transition to net zero. Our industry is firmly committed to net zero, and we see ourselves as partners in that transition. The Future Gas Strategy was released by the federal government last month, and it was very welcome in terms of the very clear messages that it sent about the long-term role of gas in our energy mix to 2050 and beyond. This is, again, because of that role of gas in electricity generation, also in manufacturing. If we want to capture those new opportunities around net zero, including processing critical minerals, that actually will need more gas because it relies on high temperature, reliable, controllable heat. The Future Gas Strategy, in addition to setting that clear pathway for gas long term, was very important in also confirming our commitment to be a reliable and stable supplier of LNG to the region. So we have very long-standing trading relationships with countries like Japan and Korea. Until recently, we were the world's largest exporter of LNG, and it's vital that we're maintaining those relationships long term. The Future Gas Strategy was also important in underscoring the role of carbon capture and storage technologies in supporting the decarbonisation of our economy. These are technologies that are important not just for our industry, but for other heavy industry, steel, cement, chemicals processing. And in fact, the International Energy Agency has found that getting to net zero without CCS is virtually impossible. So it was welcome that the Future Gas Strategy did put emphasis on those opportunities for Australia to create new industries, but also support decarbonisation.
So I want to get to carbon capture and storage in a moment, but I need you to dumb this down for me a little bit. How does it actually work in practice? So we have wind and solar being sources and eventually primary sources, and then gas filling the gaps. That might be a huge gap, and in some sectors might be particularly large, in other areas less so, and it's around peak demand. I get that. Is it as simple as that, that the actual grid is able to get the input of these different power sources and mix and match as necessary. Like, I've got to say that the process, the logistics always confuse me.
Yeah. So when we are talking about the electricity system, which is just one part of our energy mix, gas plays that important role in being able to switch on and off very quickly. So if there's an increase in demand or a decline in production of energy from other sources, including renewables, gas can step in and be that safety net. And so that's why it's so important that we have that gas-fired power generation there to fill those gaps, essentially. But of course, gas will also continue to be really important in other parts of the economy, and that includes in terms of home heating, where it's used directly, but also in industry, where it's used either as a feedstock in some applications or for really high temperature heat. And these are applications that can't be electrified, so renewables aren't ready to step in and replace a role for gas.
Stay with me, Samantha. We'll be back in a minute. I'm speaking to Sam McCulloch, CEO of Australian Energy Producers. So do you think there's a role for gas for, certainly for decades, but for longer than decades?
Certainly all of the analysis, domestically in Australia, but also when you look at global pathways to net zero, there's a misconception, I think, that net zero means that we have no fossil fuels in the mix. But even in really ambitious scenarios, you still have almost 20% of the energy mix coming from fossil fuels in 2050. And that's predominantly gas. And that's because gas is irreplaceable in so many applications, and because we'll continue to need gas in power generation as that reliable backup. So gas will be with us for some time, and it's really important that we're investing today in the supply that we need to meet that demand. That was the key finding of the Future Gas Strategy, that we need to be investing urgently now in new supply to ensure that we can meet demand, not just in the power sector, but for industrial applications and households across Australia.
Okay, so you mentioned carbon capture and storage. More correctly, it's actually carbon capture utilisation and storage, CCUS. The International Energy Agency has said that getting to net zero without CCUS is virtually impossible. You just highlighted that point there. You see a big opportunity here for Australia and for the gas industry specifically. Firstly, how does it work in terms of CCUS, and then how can you roll it out?
So CCS is a really key technology for net zero. It involves capturing CO2 from point sources, so that could be industrial facilities or a power station, and safely and permanently storing the CO2 deep underground, up to 2 kilometres underground. This is often in depleted oil and gas reservoirs, so that have already held gas for millions of years. So in some ways you can think about it as the oil and gas industry in reverse, where we're putting the gases back down underground. It's a key technology for net zero because there are few alternatives to CCS in some sectors, including in heavy industry, cement production, for example. So we know we'll need CCS also for carbon removal. So you can now take CO2 directly out of the atmosphere and store it. So emissions that have already been emitted can now be captured directly from the air and stored. And those carbon removal opportunities are actually the key for getting the net in net zero and striking that balance that we need. In terms of Australia's opportunity, we have all of the tools that we need to deploy CCS effectively. And in fact, we already are home to one of the largest CCS projects in the world at the Gorgon CCS facility. We'll have another major CCS facility in operation later this year at Moomba. And there are about 6 or 7 other large-scale facilities under development around Australia. This is really important, not just for the oil and gas industry, but for those other heavy industries that will need to rely on CCS to be consistent with net zero targets. Importantly, CCS is also an opportunity for us to expand our trading relationships, including with our existing trading partners of Japan and Korea. These countries are not blessed with the same geological storage that we are, and they're looking for partners, including with Australia, to be able to ship their CO2 back and safely and permanently store it to meet their own decarbonisation objectives. We recently released some studies that actually highlighted that this could be a revenue generator in the order of $600 billion, according to Wood Mackenzie, for Australia because of the demand for CO2 storage in our region.
The logistics of this works too. You can somehow get carbon to some sort of form that you can transport long distances and to Gorgon or from overseas?
Absolutely. So you can compress the CO2. This is a technology that's been used for decades, and there are more than 7,000 kilometres of pipelines in the US where CO2 is moved around. It's a technology that's been used for decades, so we know it's proven, we know we can do it. Now the challenge is really ensuring we can roll it out at the scale and pace that we need to meet our net zero targets.
So wrapping all this up, we will see less coal-fired power stations, and we're seeing that, and we have times where that will we have dates for some of those to close. In terms of gas products, we may not actually see less. We may actually need more of it, at least in coming decades as we head towards net zero, and then renewables will increase over time. Is that kind of the big picture?
Certainly, even our Australian energy market operator is signalling that we need to build another 13 gigawatts of new gas-fired power generation just on the East Coast to be able to ensure that we have that reliable electricity supply for Australian households and businesses. So there's an important role for gas going forward, long-term in power generation. There's also new opportunities, I should say, to use gas domestically. That includes producing low-carbon hydrogen. So you can produce low-carbon hydrogen from natural gas combined with carbon capture and storage technologies. And this is a pathway that's between 2 and 6 times cheaper than renewable-based hydrogen currently. So it's a really key way for us to start to develop those hydrogen markets and hydrogen supply for our industrial sector. But it does rely on a steady supply of natural gas.
Sam, do you think one of the big challenges here is understanding what you're talking about? So you talk to me and I get it, and I'm a big fan of CCS, and I truly believe that you do need gas in the transition because otherwise the lights are going to go out literally. Do you think that point, though, is clear enough to the general population? And, you know, all the debate we have around it, political or non-political, sometimes I think the education piece there might be missing a little bit.
Well, certainly I think it's important that we're communicating with the broader community about the energy transitions, the challenges inherent in the energy transition, and the role for gas in providing that reliable and stable electricity and energy supply. As an organisation, we're trying to support that. We have a national campaign running that's highlighting the role of gas, in particular in electricity generation. But it's key that we have an informed and balanced debate and discussion about the energy mix going forward. It's clear from all of the analysis from the Future Gas Strategy that gas will play a really important and growing and evolving role to 2050 and beyond. And we need to ensure that we're communicating that effectively to the broader community who do need to and rightly expect reliable and affordable energy. And gas will be part of that.
Sam, thank you for talking to Fear and Greed.
Thanks so much, Sean.
That was Samantha McCulloch, Chief Executive of Australian Energy Producers, a great supporter of this podcast. This is the Fear and Greed Business Interview. Join us every morning for the full episode of Fear and Greed, daily business news for people who make their own decisions. I'm Sean Aylmer. Enjoy your day.